Namaste friends. Today we will be discussing about houses and their significators. Basically there are 12 houses in astrology. Each house deals with a specific domain in our life. So let's begin with the first house. The first house represents the individual, which is self. You can also make out the appearance of the person, the overall health, the longevity of the person, whether the person is prosperous in life, the attitude, as well as the intellect. What kind of an intellectual is this person or the native? Now, medically, it also represents the head of the person. The second house talks about the immediate family, speech, the food habits. It also shows us what kind of allergies a person basically has. The overall wealth of a person. It's not just the bank balance, it basically shows us the purchasing capacity of a person. It also deals with precious metals, so you can have gold assets or silver assets. And medically, it deals with the neck and throat. The third house deals with all kinds of communication. It could be a media, social media, and any kind of communication, email, fax. It also deals with documentation. When I say documentation, it could mean if you're applying for a passport or a visa for a country or your Aadhaar documentation or any kind of an ID, basically. All these things come under documentation. It also talks about commission. So if somebody is interested in uh, getting into a business of which involves commission, third house is very very important. There are certain keywords which I have highlighted in a different color here. I will come back to this once we discuss all the 12 houses. The fourth house represents our mother, the place where we live, the vehicles that we can own. It also talks about basic education. Now, this is a very subjective term. Basic education could mean different things in different countries. For example, if you take basic education in India, it could cover up to grade 12, but the same thing could mean up to grade 10 in certain countries, or it could mean up to the level of graduation in certain countries. So you will have to analyze this based on the country where the person is based. Fourth house also represents non-curable disease. I will explain this a little bit more when we talk about the sixth house. It also represents the domestic comfort, because we are talking about the place where we live. Domestic comfort also falls under this house. Fourth house is also responsible for Vastu, and it also deals with the hospitality segment. When I say hospitality, if somebody is interested in opening a restaurant or a hotel, you will have to see if the fourth house is supportive. Moving on to the fifth house. Fifth house is all about natural creativity. Any kind of creativity comes under the domain of fifth house. Fifth house also deals with the first child. It is also very important for art, sports, or sports persons. Fifth house also deals with speculation. So, if somebody is interested in investing in the stock market, their fifth house has to be strong. Fifth house also deals with entertainment, just like sports. If you have somebody walk in and say, "Can I become a successful actor?" Fifth house is very, very important for them. Fifth house is also the house of solutions and healing. We proceed on the significations for the sixth house. I would like to remind you that there is a rule in KP which says that the 12th house from the current house will negate the results of the current house. So if sixth house is talking about job, the fifth house will negate the results of the job, which means the person will become jobless. Similarly, if sixth house talks about disease that a person can get, the fifth house will negate the disease. That's why we see healing as a signification for the fifth house. Now, if you go one step before this, which means if you talk about the fourth house, it is a non-curable disease. It represents non-curable disease. What it means is if sixth house is giving me the disease, fifth house is responsible for healing. If fifth house is healing and the person cannot be healed the disease, it is basically the fourth house. That is why fourth house will negate the fifth house, so there will be no healing, which means it's a non-curable disease. This is the logic. You need to understand the logic in KP so you can always build on the significators. Sixth house also deals with divorce. The reason for that is seventh house is the house of marriage. So sixth house is responsible for divorce or even separation. Sixth house also deals with litigations, loans. It also talks about our enemy. Sixth house also represents services. Now, any kind of a service oriented company, all these things come under the domain of sixth house. Sixth house also represents the tenant, and any kind of a money transaction, whether you are giving out money or you are borrowing money, both these can be seen from the sixth house. And sixth house also represents our daily routine. When I say daily routine, it means if you are in if you're going for a gym or you're into exercising, all those things are part of the sixth house. Moving on to the seventh house. Seventh house, as I said earlier, is the house of marriage. It represents our legal partner. So it could be a spouse or even a business partner. Both are seen from the seventh house. Seventh house is also the house of business. That's where you see venture. Customers. Our customer is represented by the seventh house, or anybody we meet is also represented by our seventh house. Seventh house is also part of daily interaction. That's why I said anybody we meet comes under the domain of seventh house. Retail businesses and second child. I will come back to this once we cover the 12 houses. Eighth house is commonly referred to as the house of pain or problems. It shows us the mode of death for the native. It also represents research, occult sciences, manufacturing, insurance, pension, etc. Ninth house represents our father and guru or teachers. It also shows us about the higher education for the native. Now, higher education is again a very subjective term, similar to what I told you about basic education when we spoke about the fourth house. So depending on where the native lives, you will have to consider what is categorized as higher education. Voyage or even long distance travel and any kind of a consultancy also can be seen from the ninth house. Ninth house also deals with astrology. I have also mentioned about stranger here. Now this is especially important if you come across a query wherein the native wants to know whether he or she can advertise on the internet to look for a spouse. Now, when we spoke about the third house, we discussed about any kind of a communication or media. So if you are advertising on the internet advertising comes under the domain of third house, and since when you don't know who you are actually going to meet, that person becomes a stranger. So if there is connection between the third house and the ninth house, especially when you are analyzing for marriage, you can say that yes, the native can advertise on the net and look for an alliance. Ninth house also deals with luck and dharma, or religion or religious practices. 10th house is the house of our profession. Now, when I say profession, it could either mean a job or it could mean a business. So, when you have a native who wants to find out whether taking up a job is suitable or getting into business is more suitable, the first thing you will do is analyze if the 10th house is supportive for a job or for a business. So 10th house represents our karma. 10th house also deals with the status or identity that we as an individual have. It represents the government. It also represents our employer. It also talks about authority. Since we are talking about government, it also talks about authority or even administration. Coming to the 11th house, 11th house is seen as the house of profit, gain, wish fulfillment. It's always seen as a very, very positive house. Anything that gets connected with the 11th house is generally fruitful. So it's called the house of victory. It also represents our social circle, friends. It forms the society for us and also represents NGOs or non-government organization. The 12th house is also seen as being problematic, similar to what we saw when we discussed about the 8th house. But that is not true. Any house for that matter will always have significations which are good as well as those which are not so fruitful. So there are no good or bad houses or no good or bad planets. So the 12th house deals with the hospitals, police, foreign land. So if somebody is interested to travel abroad, the 12th house has to be connected. 12th house also represents our expenses and losses. It also deals with isolation, jail, because jail is a place where an individual is isolated. And 12th house also deals with drugs and addiction. 12th house is also responsible for the investments that we make. Investment is also a kind of an expense. So if you are buying property and you are making a down payment, 12th house has to be active. And 12th house also deals with charity. There are a few keywords which I have highlighted in a different color. So I'll give you the logic for this. Before we get into the logic, let me define the rule for you. Of course, the rule has to be applied based on the context. The rule says that the third house from the current house will add to the result, or it can even multiply sometimes. Now, just to give you an example here, when we discussed about the 5th house, we said it represents the first child for the native. Now, if you recollect the rule, I said the third house from the current house, that is 5, 6, 7, this is 1, 2, 3. So the 7th house will represent the second child, so on and so forth. So if you have to look for the third child, 1, 2, 3. So the 9th house will represent the third child. Similarly, if the first house represents self, third from the first will represent the younger siblings. Going by the same logic, if first house represents the self, if you go backwards, the 11th house will represent the elder siblings for the native. Now let us understand the logic behind the 10th house representing mother-in-law for the native. First house represents self. So the fourth house represents the native's mother. Similarly, seventh house represents the spouse for the native. So count 4 from there. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is the 10th house for the native is the spouse's mother. So it represents the mother-in-law for the native. You can apply the same logic which I have explained to understand how you arrive at the other significators. I hope you like this video. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.